The 2023 Human Rights Watch report says unchecked authoritarian power is leaving behind a sea of human suffering. It spotlights abuses happening in 100 countries, covering from everything from war, media freedom, gender rights, and refugees, among other things. It puts the war in Ukraine at the top of the agenda, saying Russian President Vladimir Putin is operating with impunity. It welcomes the international community's response, including the UN agencies collecting evidence on the war crimes, but also says the crises are being ignored, calling on governments and international organizations to take action.
Last year has seen essentially an all-out assault on human rights across the world, whether it be the war in Ukraine, the war in Tigray, the repression and oppression of protesters from Iran to China. We have seen these patterns across the world. But the interesting thing is that we have seen in the face of this, people are standing up, and not only are they saying no to human rights abusers, are they saying no to the dictators and the despots, they're actually demanding their human rights. You know, there have been a plethora of abuses by Russian forces, both during the conflict but also as the Russian forces have withdrawn from certain towns and villages. Our teams have actually been on the ground within hours and days of the Russian forces actually withdrawing, and we've spoken to witnesses and we've actually seen the evidence of nothing less than sheer terror and horror. It's a question of political will. What we saw in Ukraine was that states were willing to come, the situation was so serious that states were willing to work together in new and unlikely coalitions, came together to work on justice and accountability mechanisms. But in particular in Europe, we saw something very interesting where the European states came together to actually welcome refugees. The response to refugees in Europe was unprecedented. We saw.
Now, for more on this Human Rights Watch report for 2023, we can now speak to Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, who joins us live from London. Hello, John. Great to have you as always. Now, we see that this report has touched literally every single part of the globe. But what are some of the main findings, in your opinion?
Hi there, great to be on Newsday. Well, look, it's a very powerful report on the brutality of certain regimes throughout the world. One thinks of Afghanistan, where the Taliban took over after the US-led withdrawal in August 2021, where the human rights of women and girls in that country have been absolutely cut back to the bone. Women unable to go out in public on their own, without a full burqa, not able to travel, not able to have any education. I mean, the Taliban have really rolled back the years, back to the dark ages as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Then we have, as already mentioned, the mess in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, almost a year old now. And the report also accuses both sides of human rights abuses, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and calls for something more to be done. There's also countries like Iran, for example, where Mahsa Amini died in morality police custody last year, and the ongoing demonstrations about that. There's a lot of focus in this report too on Myanmar, formerly Burma, that saw a military coup in 2021, and the elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi thrown into jail. And the report particularly focuses on Myanmar and the human rights abuses by the military there, which are just ongoing on a daily basis in that country. So it is a scathing look at some of the world's trouble spots. But as you heard from that soundbite from the Human Rights Watch spokesperson, there are chinks in the armor that, people are resisting. For example, in Iran, they are demonstrating against the brutal regime. There's demonstrations in Burma and elsewhere. So there is hope, as far as the report goes, for some progress to be made on human rights in where we do have these dictatorships.
Well, John, speaking of scathing, how scathing would you say this report was when it came to Western governments in
Well,
it?
basically, it says that Western governments should do a lot more. For example, in Russia's case, the report speculates that Western nations like America and the UK and other European countries should have brought Putin to book over Syria, for example. And the writing was already on the wall as to what he was going to do in Ukraine. And the report says Putin should have been made accountable for his past sins before the invasion of Ukraine. Also, going back to Myanmar, there's a powerful section in the report which says that governments like the US and the UK, they hide behind regional deference to justify their own lack of action in countries like Myanmar. And the report concludes that all governments should bring the same spirit of solidarity to human crises around the world and not just do it when it suits them. So Western governments come into a fair amount of criticism there, although I have to say in Myanmar's case and indeed in Iran, Western governments have imposed sanctions, but then Human Rights Watch says, well, they just don't go far enough.
A morbid outlook, really, on the current state of human rights globally. But thank you to our RISE Chief Correspondent, John Cookson, for delving into that for us. We look forward to having you again very soon.